By the third week of September 1887, every open plowed strip firebreak between the Solomon River and the Concord Flats Church had failed to hold a single yard of ground against the fire that came down off the ridge. Caleb Renz had not. He had dug his firebreak twice, a trench, then a second trench 11 feet behind the first, with the cut sod stacked and turned to bare earth in between. The county had laughed at that. Otis Grieve called it a cripple's idea of farm work, digging holes instead of plowing like a man. By the time the fire reached the church steeple and stopped dead at Wren's second trench, no one in Concord Flats was laughing. Months earlier, no one believed a lame man's ditches would be the thing that saved the town's only belle. Caleb had walked with a built-up boot since he was 9, the year the barn fire took his father and left Caleb's leg scarred from knee to ankle where he'd been dragged clear. He didn't talk about it. He kept his father's pocket watch, stopped at 11 minutes past 2, the hour the barn beam came down, on a nail by the door where he saw it going in and out every day. By the spring of 1887 he'd proved up his own claim north of town, alone, and decided that the single strip fire breaks every other farmer plowed were a promise the Prairie would eventually collect on. He started digging in June. Not one trench, two, set 11 feet apart, the strip between them scraped down to raw dirt with nothing left to burn. Hiram Cutter, who ran cattle on the section next to his, rode the fence line and didn't dismount. "One strip stops fire same as two," he said. "You're just digging twice the hole for half the cents." The Reverend Josiah Tielm put it plainer, from the church steps, in front of half the congregation. "The Lord gave this prairie grass for grazing, not trenching. A farmer's supposed to work the ground, not carve it up like a grave." Caleb didn't argue with either of them. He'd already worked out which forces would decide whether Concord Flats stood or burned, and none of them cared what the Reverend thought was proper. Fuel, wind, ember, moisture. He said the words the way another man might recite scripture, because out here they amounted to the same kind of protection. His first trench failed within a month, and it failed for a reason rooted exactly where it should have. Fuel. He'd cut the strip between the trenches too narrow, 6 feet instead of 11, hurrying because the digging hurt his leg and he wanted it finished. A grass fire started by a neighbor's stubble burn jumped the narrow gap easily, embers riding a light wind clean across 6 feet of bare dirt to catch on the far side. It burned to his second trench and stopped there, but it had jumped the first, and Caleb stood looking at the scorched strip a long time. "It didn't jump because the fire was strong," he said finally, to the boy sitting on the fence rail behind him. "It jumped because I left it enough fuel to reach across on." That was Tobias Aldrich, 10 years old, the Reverend's own son, who'd taken to following Caleb around against his father's wishes because Caleb let him hold the surveyor's chain and never told him to go home. Tobias kept a weather book, not because anyone asked him to, but because he liked watching the sky and liked having something that was his. He'd started noting wind direction and speed morning and evening in a scrap ledger. Caleb hadn't thought much of it until the day Tobias said, "Winds backed around to the northwest 3 days running," and Caleb realized the boy had been keeping a record more useful than anything the fire warden had ever posted. He widened the strip to 11 feet and packed the second trench's spoil into a raised berm on the outer edge, giving embers a wall to climb before they could reach any fuel at all. The trenches held through a stubble burn in August that scorched 3 neighboring fields black. That solved one problem. It created another. Burr A stopped fire still smoked, and smoke drew questions from the town council, who'd passed a new fire guard ordinance that spring, requiring every claim within 2 miles of the church to maintain an adequate firebreak, plowed or otherwise, subject to inspection, on pain of losing grazing rights on the town commons. Caleb's otherwise trenches had never been plowed at all, and Otis Grieve, who sat on the council, made sure the fire warden heard about it before anyone heard it from Caleb. The warden's name was Delbert Voss, and he rode out in August with a notebook, not an opinion. He measured the trench widths, noted the bare strip's fuel load, and told Caleb flatly he'd be back before first frost to see whether the design held through an actual fire season, not just a controlled burn. "Ordinances get satisfied on paper," Voss said. "I need to see it standing after real flame, not before it." That was the threat's second shape, no longer a line in a council resolution, but a man with a notebook who'd decide Caleb's grazing rights by what a real fire did to his ditches before he came back. It was the woman who arrived in early September who told him what his design still lacked, and she told him without meaning to teach him anything at all. Her name was Sula Vance, and she came through looking for day work, driving a wagon with a water barrel lashed so tight it looked more cared for than the horse pulling it. She studied the double trench a long moment before she said a word, the way a person does who has watched fire take something once and doesn't intend to watch it happen again unwarned. "Your ditches will stop ground fire," she said. "They won't stop embers that jump the whole strip on a strong gust and land burning on your roof thatch 100 yards past your trench. You need wet ground past the break, not just bare ground. Bare dirt still lets a landed ember catch on whatever's beyond it." She showed him keeping grain sacks soaked in the well trough near the house and outbuildings, ready to beat out a spot fire the trenches couldn't stop, because trenches stopped fire that crawled, not fire that flew. Caleb asked her, one evening, why a woman who clearly understood ember behavior as well as any warden was driving a wagon alone with a full water barrel instead of settled on a claim of her own. She didn't answer right away. Then, I kept the fire lookout tower west of here 2 years back. Watched a blaze jump a river I'd have sworn no ember could cross, on a wind I didn't clock in time. Cabin I loved was on the far side. She said it flat, the way you say something already grieved all the way through. I don't miss warnings anymore. She never spoke of it again, and Caleb never asked her to, but from that week on, wet sacks hung by every door on the place, not just the ones near the trenches. The real fire came the second week of October, 11 days before Voss had promised to return, driven off the ridge by a wind that had backed around to the northwest exactly as Tobias's weather book had been warning it might for 3 days running. Caleb saw the smoke line before he heard anyone shout it, recognized the particular flat orange glow low on the horizon that meant grass fire moving fast with wind behind it, not a controlled burn drifting. It came from the northwest, the exact bearing his trenches had been dug to face, the bearing Sula had insisted mattered most. Fuel was tested first. The 11-foot bare strip between his two trenches held nothing for the ground fire to cross on, and it stalled there along most of his line the way it was built to. Wind was tested next, and tested hard, gusts strong enough to loft embers well past any ground-level gap, exactly the failure Sula had warned him about, and burning grass fragments began landing 100 yards beyond the trenches, on dry roof thatch and unburned stubble alike. But solving fuel and accounting for wind hadn't prepared him for where the fourth force would turn against the town instead of his own claim. Moisture was what Concord Flats itself was short on. The church steeple's cedar shingles, dry as any roof in the county, caught from a single ember riding that same northwest gust, clean over the plowed single strip breaks the rest of the town had trusted, breaks that had never accounted for anything but crawling fire. Caleb saw the steeple smoke from his own yard. He didn't think about the ordinance or the council or what Voss would say. He and Sula loaded the wet grain sacks and the water barrel onto his wagon and drove for town with the fire still crawling behind them, held for now at his own double trench, but climbing toward Cutter's unprotected fence line on its way past. They found Otis Grieve on the church steps, close enough to smell the shingles smoking, too far up a ladder someone had already knocked loose to get down safely on his own. It was the wet sacks, soaked and ready before anyone needed them, that let Sula and Caleb beat the roof fire back long enough for Grieve to climb down, coughing, his sleeves scorched through. Caleb used the surveyor's rope he'd carried all summer for staking trench lines to lash the loose ladder steady enough for the last descent, the same rope that had marked 11 feet of bare ground now holding a man's weight instead. Grieve did not thank him that night. He didn't have the breath for it, standing in the churchyard watching his own unprotected section already smoking a mile off. But he stood there and watched Caleb's double trench holding a clean line against ground fire, while the plowed single strips around town had let embers through everywhere else, and he didn't say another word about holes dug instead of honest plowing. Voss rode out 11 days later than he'd promised, delayed by fire damage on every road out of Concord Flats. He didn't need his notebook long. The double trench stood, scorched black along both edges but unbreached, the bare strip between them still bare, while every single strip break he'd ridden past on the way had let fire through to blacken pasture behind it. He signed off on Caleb's grazing rights without asking a question Caleb had feared. The ordinance's interest in his ditches ended there, resolved not by argument but by the fire itself, having already made the case for him. Hiram Cutter didn't make any speech about the virtue of double trenches. He simply showed up the following week and asked, quietly, how far apart to set them, and whether 11 feet held in every soil or just Caleb's particular ground. The emotional payoff came that winter, when Tobias Aldrich, against his father's continued disapproval, though quieter now, asked to keep the weather ledger going through the cold months, and Caleb hung his father's stopped pocket watch on a new nail inside the boy's own coat pocket, rather than his door, telling him a watch that never moved again was still worth carrying if it reminded a person what timing cost. The technical payoff he gave once, plainly, to Tobias that same afternoon, because he wanted the boy to understand the mechanism and not just the outcome. Fire needs fuel to cross ground, and wind will carry an ember past any gap that isn't wide enough or wet enough to starve it when it lands. 2 trenches and a wet line beyond them covered what one strip alone never could. The thematic payoff arrived in the change of language around town. What Otis Grieve had once called a cripple's idea of farm work, he now called, without apparent irony, Wren's line, and recommended it to any new claim filed within 2 miles of the church. The legacy payoff came 4 years later, when Tobias Aldrich, 14, and keeping his own weather book, without anyone's permission needed anymore, walked a visiting land agent along the double trench, still holding firm on the north edge of Concord Flats, and told him precisely what Sula Vance had once told a lame farmer, who hadn't asked to be taught anything at all. Fire doesn't jump ground it can't feed on, but it will always find the one gap you didn't think mattered enough to wet.